Welcome back to another Excel JavaScript API tutorial. So today is the big one, at least for those of you who are interested about creating custom functions inside the Excel JavaScript API. So this was definitely a heavily requested topic that people asked if I could go over. And so I now have everything that I need. I've got my examples all ready to go, and I've kind of got my little speech ready. And so now we can go over the wonderful topic. So, what is the custom functions? What are they trying to do? Why would you want to use them? Well, if you do come from a VBA background, you do know that one of the benefits of using Excel VBA is that you can create custom functions for Excel. Why is that a cool thing? Well, what it allows you to do is it allows you to extend functionality beyond just the standard formulas that you get inside of Excel. Now, Excel has a lot of formulas, so it's kind of actually hard sometimes to think of something that's not already there, but it does give a certain level of flexibility. And so naturally, because Excel VBA, that was one of the core features of it, Microsoft obviously wanted to incorporate it in the JavaScript API. And so we can build our own custom functions that do a wide range of tasks using the JavaScript API. Now, when we do talk about functions, we have to understand there are different types of functions. Even though they might look similar in the syntax form, they actually can behave very differently behind the scenes. So I've done my best to kind of, I would say, categorize them or try to put them into groups that I think naturally go well with each other. And then ideally what we'll see is that, if you want to do this particular type of task, you're going to use this group of functions. So I am going to be posting this workbook on the GitHub, and then I'm probably going to also be posting it on the Facebook group that I have. I'm trying to be better about posting the workbooks because I know sometimes it's great having the code, but if you don't really have the workbook, it doesn't really help that much. So I am going to start trying to put that mainly on the Facebook group, I think, unless I kind of get a better place of maybe thinking to put it. I'll try to do that. I'm still kind of trying to figure that out just to see how I need to organize it. But I think for right now, assume it's either going to be on GitHub or the Facebook group. Alrighty. So I did provide some links to resources. So if you do follow any of these links, these are going to basically just take you directly to the Microsoft documentation for this topic. So I do encourage you to read through this. It's actually a very interesting read. I at least found it interesting. I'm sure some people would go like, you find many things interesting that you shouldn't find interesting, but I thought it was neat. And it was just interesting to see kind of how they've developed it and stuff like that. So pretty cool stuff. Additionally, we're going to be doing this all through the Script Lab add-in. So if you haven't already, you want to make sure you get an installation of that just for the time being. But we can also build custom functions when we actually create add-ins using the Yeoman generator. So I just provide some documentation links for you in case you need it. I do encourage you to read over it. So now that we've done that, we're going to start going through the high-level categories of functions. Some of these are my own definition, and some of these are coming directly from Microsoft. So, sorry, I misspelled something. Microsoft's description. Just because I thought they did a good job of explaining it. So I said, hey, why do something that's already doing a pretty good job? So the first type of function that we're going to work with is what I call standard. These are very easy to interpret functions. This is, for example, something as simple as, hey, I want to add two numbers. Nothing crazy, but it's a simple idea. It's usually taking very simple inputs and it's returning some type of output. We can extend our standard functions to include optional arguments. So we can basically say, hey, every argument that you pass through, you don't technically have to give it to me, but we do have to build it in such a way where we can handle the situation where if that particular element is not passed through, what are we going to do? So basically, with optional arguments, we're just simply extending the standard one to say, okay, some arguments you need to have, other ones you don't need to have. Repeating arguments is basically the way I kind of like to think of it is usually there's some type of series of inputs, and so they're repeating. So you might have a series of numbers, you might have a series of strings, whatever you want to call it. Normally, there is a series of arguments, and you don't know how many you're going to be getting. And so because of that, we call this a repeating argument because you don't know how many you're going to be getting, but the idea is that you're going to take each one of those repeating arguments and doing some type of operation on them. It sounds, most time people when they hear this, like, oh, this sounds kind of like, like a range, right? Sort of, but you don't technically have to pass through a range. You could just pass through user-defined input. So you could say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I don't even have to specify a range with my standard function. The idea is that it's repeating in the sense of it's taking some number of inputs and they're kind of all the same. Okay, then we have range arguments. These are obviously really important when you're working in Excel, but this would actually be taking like a range of cells. So if I was selecting like this range of cells, this would be my input. So my argument is a range object. Normally what we're doing is we're iterating over that range and we're doing something to it. Maybe we are, finding the max value, or maybe we're finding the second highest level, the second highest value or something like that. So the idea behind a range function is you're taking a range object as an input. Oh, invocation, we'll call it that. So this one is an interesting one. This actually is really helpful sometimes. This one is referring to the cell that was being called. So sometimes when we when we use a function, what we can do is we can specify the cell that contains the formula. And what we can do is we could maybe do something like, hey, return the address for the cell that this formula exists in. This will make a little bit more sense when you see it, but basically the idea behind it is it's kind of thing. It's basically it's giving you the context. It's giving like the context, or it's basically giving the context of who was calling that formula. Technically, every function, every custom function is actually passed this argument. So it's basically every function we build, it's going to be using this as an argument. So even if we don't specify it, technically it's always there. We can just choose when and when not to use it. However, it is helpful when we want to get additional context about maybe who was calling this formula, something along that nature. Again, we're going to keep the examples simple for right now, but ideally kind of as we explore this topic, hopefully in more depth, we'll kind of see where this might be advantageous. Okay, so then we get to arrays. Ooh, arrays, right? So arrays come in 3 flavors. We have spill down, spill right, and spill rectangle. So the idea behind an array formula is that it's going to return multiple values at once, and it's usually some type of array object, right? So the idea behind it is that if I use a spill down formula, I'm going to have my, we'll just call it my array something, right? And it would spill down the following cells, right? So to give you an idea, random array, we'll just say 1, 4, 5, 10. We'll say 10, and then integer, okay. And you can kind of see as my columns are absolutely massive, you can see it's spilling to the right, right? So this is spilling to the right, but it's because I only specified 1 row. But if I specify 1 column and I specify 10 rows, now I'm spilling down. And then if I specify 4 columns, I'm spilling rectangle. So that's the whole idea behind a dynamic array, is it will spill in the direction that we specify. So these are going to be really helpful when we want to return a result, like basically a set of results. Then we have asynchronous. These are functions where the data is constantly changing. So this might be something where we're getting the time or something like that. Basically it's asynchronous in the sense of it's not static. It's not going to just kind of stay there one time. It might be constantly making a request or something like that. So asynchronous is that's constantly changing. Then we have web request, which is basically an extension of asynchronous, but now we're basically making a web request from that function. So we'll kind of see this in more behavior. And then we have volatile. So these will basically change every time they are calculated, even if the argument hasn't changed. So that's the idea behind volatile. These are the ones that can slow down your workbooks if you're not careful, because if you have a bunch of volatile functions, guess what? Even if the inputs don't change, it's calculating. And if you've got a bunch of them, that's one way to slow down your workbooks. I've seen that happen many of times. Okay, let's get coding. So normally how it's going to look is we're going to have some code. We're going to have an example. I'm going to walk through the code. We'll see it in Script Lab. For the most part, these are usually pretty straightforward. So don't be surprised if I'm not typing a lot and I'm more just talking. I think for the most part, these are pretty self-explanatory sometimes. Okay, so assuming you have Script Lab installed, you're going to go to your tab on the ribbon that's called Script Lab. And then you have three options. You have functions, you have run, and you have code. So if you click functions and you expand it out a little bit, you will see all the functions that you currently have inside your particular workbook. Now I have a bunch because I've already written a bunch of them. So right now I'm seeing everything, but you might not have any because you don't have any functions, but I have a lot right now. And then it will tell you basically the name and how to call that function. So this is how to call that function. And then we have some metadata. So the metadata is basically like a JSON file where you specify the ID of your function. So this should be unique. We have a name, the parameter, the name of the parameter, the type. So what kind of data type is it? And the results. So what result are we going to be sent back in that particular result type? We can also add a description if we want. So you don't have to add a description, but you should. And then you can also add descriptions to your arguments. So that's also helpful. You really should add descriptions. It does make it a little bit easier to understand. But you can see I have a bunch of arguments in here, and a lot of these are just the examples that you find online, but I think it's pretty cool for the most part. And then if you click refresh, it will refresh as you make changes, and we'll kind of explain kind of what that looks like from a coding perspective. Okay, so basically from here, this is kind of how it's going to look. Well, these are just your libraries that you're importing. But with this one, you will see normally what it's going to look like is we're going to have some type of string that defines the documentation string for our particular function. This will explain things like the parameters, the return types, and stuff like that. We then have our function. We specify the name of our function, the name of our arguments, their type, what this function is going to return as a type, and then basically what our function is going to be doing. Now, if you do want to access this, I do encourage you to go usually over here. So if you click the little 3 lines, you will see from here just different examples. So these are usually the snippets. So those are my snippets. Those are ones that I've created. But if you want to see sample ones that are available to you, you can see them all over here. And then you can also do new snippets as well. So you can actually add new snippets if you want. And then you can do something like that. Now for functions, normally what I'll just tell people to do is if you go down to samples, and then if you go to custom functions, here you go. So these are where the custom functions are going to be. Just use those ones for right now. Those ones seem to work, and then you'll get the register capability as well. So just do that for right now. Go to samples and then custom functions, and you should be fine. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'll close that out, and let's talk about our simple function. Well, the most simple function we can do is just a standard function. So these are a function where every argument is required. So let's create just a simple add function. The idea behind this function is it takes 2 inputs. They're both going to be numbers, and it's going to return the sum of those 2 numbers. So from Script Lab's perspective, what we do is if you go inside here, I've defined my function. So the first thing is I give it a description. That's the first part of the doc string. I then define it as a custom function. So I use that wonderful keyword right there. And then I also use parameters, the param argument to specify that that is a parameter. I define the name of my parameter. And then from there, I also give it basically the type. So here I'm saying, hey, this is going to be of type of a number. And then I also specify what this returns. And then I'm saying the sum of the numbers. So basically, this is a kind of a description behind it, right? So this is describing what is being returned to us. So very useful, very helpful. I kind of like it. I think it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so once you've written your function, you need to register your function. So if you go right up here, you're going to see your register key. If you click register, it's going to register all your functions, and then you're going to be taken to your functions pane where you can see a summary of all the functions that you have access to. So now that it's been registered, you can actually call it from Excel. So for example, if I do equals script lab, you'll see all the functions that we've registered inside of script lab. And so some of these, depending on when I created them, are named a little bit differently. But in this case, what I want is, I want add 10. Oh, not that one. Sorry, not that one. I want add, right? So this was from an old one, disregard that. You want exploring custom functions. Normally I would say it's usually the name of the actual, what is the name of the actual code module that you've done. So really what you should be looking for is script lab, the name of the code module, and then at the name of your function. And so if I call this, I can see that it's just going to take my one argument and then my second argument. And then usually pops up with that busy one. And then we can see here that it simply adds the two numbers. Now with here, let's see what happens if, oh, well, this one's a little bit different. I can't remember if that's the one I wanted or not. What if I do, oh, I think I did the wrong one. Sorry. I did add. It was supposed to be add to. So if I do add to, it's basically the same idea. But the nice thing is, so you can kind of see that I have the name of my argument, and it's basically kind of guiding me, telling me like, okay, it's supposed to take this one and this one. But now, hopefully, I'm going to get my error. And it returns an error, right? Because we're passing through that third argument, but we never said that you can do a third argument, right? So obviously this is an issue. We don't want that. So we have to make sure we only pass through two arguments. Okay, so that's just using a standard function. Let's see one with an optional argument, right? So the idea is that we're just going to simply extend our standard function. And what we're going to do is we're now going to say, hey, there's some arguments that you don't have to have. You can have these as optional ones if you want. So in this case, we're going to basically take our add function. And what we're going to do is we're going to specify an optional argument. And that optional argument is a third number that you can add to it. To denote an optional argument, you put a little question mark behind it, and that basically says, hey, this one's optional. It's not required. If it does not have a question mark, then it is a required argument. Now, the way you read this is that we have a function. It's called add. It has three arguments. The first one is called first. It's a number. The second one is called second. It's a number. The third one is optional, and that's also a number. This add function will return some value that is of type number, and this is the actual code to run that function. So if that third number equals null, then treat it as 0. Otherwise, you can basically just add the three numbers. So in the case that it's null, it's just going to be 0. And then if it's an actual value, then it will actually, what is the word? It will actually be added to it. So here I basically gave you some examples. And then the name of this function, I think I called it was add optional. So it's right here. And you can see that I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. There we go. So we can see that with this one, oh geez, I like the IntelliSense, but sometimes it gets in the way. So it's still calculating the addition of both numbers. My doc string looks pretty much identical. It's just here I'm giving a little bit more of a description. And then all I did is I wrote the code for it. And so here I'm showing that, okay, I can add these three numbers and I shouldn't have an issue. Okay, but in this case, that third one, it's basically there's nothing there, but it's kind of to demonstrate that it's still going to work as you would expect. And then this final one is I just completely negate it, right? So I just completely say like, you know what, forget about it. I'm not even going to put it in there. It still works fine. So the kind of the idea that I'm trying to demonstrate here is that with that optional one, like you don't technically have to, like you can reference a cell that has no value and probably behind the scenes, it's still going to treat it as 0. But don't be afraid to do that with the optional ones. You can reference blank cells if you want. You don't have to technically just avoid it. Or you can just completely avoid and say, you know what, I don't care. I don't want a part of it. There's also that option as well. But that's the idea behind optional arguments is you use your little your little question mark notation to say, hey, this particular argument is optional and it's not required. All right. Repeating arguments. Oh, yes. So with repeating arguments, there's usually some type of series of inputs, right? So there's some type of series of inputs. And with these series of inputs, basically, I'm just going to do some operation on them. So here we're creating a function. It's called add again. And what we're doing is we're specifying the operands. That's kind of the name of the argument. And we're specifying it's a number, but we're basically using the 3 bracket notation to say that it's a repeating input. So we're not specifying how many values we're going to get. We're just saying we're expecting a series of numbers. And what we're going to be doing with those numbers is we're going to be adding them. So again, the way you would read this is, hey, I'm going to create a function called add. It has operands as its argument. So that's the name of its argument. And that argument is simply a series of numbers because we have the 3 bracket notation to denote a series of numbers. And what this function is going to do is it's going to return a number as the final value. And how it's going to return that number is it's going to basically take each value that we pass through and it's going to add it to the actual, it's going to add it to the actual total. And then it's going to return that total to us. And with that total, we should have a new value. Now in the, where is it? This one. I don't like that one. I'm going to call it something different. We'll call it add repeating. So here again, it's just kind of like we were doing over there. I'm going to register it because again, I want to give it a new name. We can see that it's here, so that's good. That's encouraging. Now, to be honest, I feel like this should scroll down. I don't think it does. I think it's a bug on Script Lab. So don't necessarily be surprised if you can't scroll down on the pane. I think that's just a bug they haven't fixed. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now what we're going to do is you can actually see too, my formula is all broken now, which is not good, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say Script Lab, and then we're going to call our add repeating, and we're going to specify our series, right? So, ooh, there we go. So it's still 10. And then what we're going to do is this is, again, just showing you a different way of calling this function. So we're going to call add repeating. And if you technically want, you could do 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 by 1. And I'm done with enough of that. And you can see it still works identical. And then also, you do not have to specify a range object. You can technically have just individual inputs. So again, before it got all corrupted, what I could do is I could say 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? So you don't have to specify a range object, just more than likely you will. Normally with the repeating ones, a range object makes just a ton of sense, right? Because usually a value of, in a range, it's going to make really good sense to add that together. So it kind of just naturally, goes together. But that is basically having repeating arguments. So that's basically taking our standard function and adding repeating arguments. So let's talk about range functions, because they're kind of interesting, right? Yeah, sort of. We'll keep it just like that. So with a range function, what we're going to be doing is we're going to create a function called second highest, and it's going to take a parameter called values. And basically, the way we need to think about this particular parameter is it's multiple ranges of values. And so what it's going to do is it's going to find the second highest value inside that particular range of cells. So basically what it first off starts doing is it says, okay, let highest be basically the first value in that range. And then it's going to say second highest is the same cell value. And it's going to start looping through each row and then each column in that range. And it's going to grab the value from that cell, because now we've looped through each row and then each column in that row. And so now we have an individual value, right? And we're going to say, okay, does the current cell that we're on, is it greater than or equal to the highest value that we currently have? Okay, then that's great. So then the second highest will now become the highest, right? So because inherently what we're saying is if we've encountered a new highest value, that means the old highest value is now the second highest value. And then the highest value is just the cell that we're currently on. And then otherwise, if we basically encounter a cell where it's not higher than the highest, then in this case, the second highest is still the one that is currently on. So that's basically the kind of the way you read this. And then it's going to ultimately return this particular function. So what does that look like from a coding perspective? Well, it looks exactly the same. So let's go see our second highest function. So we can see here that it takes basically values. And so with this one, we're saying it's any. We don't specify a type, because technically when we're kind of passing this through, we don't want to specify a number or text or anything like that. Really, you want to use the documentation to specify that, hey, this is going to be a range of values, because when we specify any, basically what we're saying is it can be anything. So to pass through a range object, you basically don't define the type. If that makes sense. I know that probably doesn't sound very helpful, because you're like, wait a minute, so I don't define the type? Yeah, you actually would not define the type. You would actually you would just specify the name of the parameter, and then basically what you're saying is it can be anything. And by anything, it means it can also be an object, which inherently a range object is. And so when you do that, you're saying, hey, I can accept a range value. So how do you call this function? Well, it's still the same, but you can notice here that when I input my argument, it's just a range of cells. And then we can see that it returns the second highest value. So the highest value was 900, and my second highest value was 800. So it did a good job. And then we have basically, I'm just trying to kind of demonstrate here that you can technically, you can still, have multiple columns, right? Because the idea behind it is a range can make up many columns and many rows. So it doesn't have to be restricted to like a 2D, matrix or anything like that. You can actually have, 3 columns and multiple rows and stuff like that. So, and then also, if you do this, you see that it actually returns an error. And that makes sense, because when you specified your argument, you didn't specify 2 separate ranges, you specified just a single range. So with range objects, it's a little bit different. You have to be very explicit about how you pass them through. You can't pass through technically multiple range arguments. You have to do just a single one. Now, what you maybe could do, and this is again just off the top of my head, and I don't know if this will necessarily work. Because technically you just specified a second argument, right? So, well, it didn't give a wrong number. It just didn't give a right one either. I don't know what the calc error specifies, to be honest. Values 2. Let's do this. There we go. I think it was because I forgot my doc string. So that's also kind of just a reminder too. It's like, it's very important that you specify your doc strings in here, because obviously if you don't, you're going to have an issue, because you're passing through a second argument. And even though here you're saying like, yeah, I know this function, I can't, from Script Lab's perspective, it doesn't know what that is. But now what we've also kind of shown is that like, hey, technically you can pass through multiple range arguments. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. In fact, sometimes that might be advantageous. Maybe you want to compare two ranges and say, hey, which ones are different, and then return a dynamic array of everything that wasn't involved in the other one. Very interesting, right? I'm actually really kind of excited to do this one. I hope to kind of do some more complex examples, so we can kind of see if we can, like, overcome some major issues we've had in the past, doing something. But that's kind of the cool thing about it. This is just more for like simple, like explaining, hey, this is what you need to do. Okay. Invocation functions. Ooh, these are fun. So with an invocation argument, basically what we are saying is we have to get some additional context about our particular, what is the word? Our particular calling cell, maybe, for example. So the idea behind it is you can require some additional context about what was being called, and then you can basically use that inside your function. So what this function is designed to do is it's going to only return the address of a cell. Now, personally, these have been a little bit new type of function for me, so I still kind of have to explore a little bit more as to where their use cases kind of work and where they're not going to work. But I thought it was interesting. I thought it was, what is the word? I don't know. It was just interesting. I liked some of the, I'm trying to think of the word. I liked some of the things related to where it could potentially lead to something like, okay, if I can get certain context information, that might be advantageous. Like, hey, like, I'm just thinking like, oh, maybe I want like the font name of that cell or something like that, right? Like, could you technically get that with these types of functions? From a definition standpoint, all we do is specify invocation, and then it's going to be the address. And so here, this is the description. It's a custom function, and then it's going to be custom functions invocation, and then uses the invocation parameter present in each cell. So this is at a cell level, and then we specify what we require from a context perspective. So we say, hey, we're going to require the address, and then we return the string. So this returns the address cell. So from a coding perspective, this is what it looks like right here. So it's identical to what we saw over there. Yeah. I want to see something really quick. Sorry, my mind always gets like bustling when I start thinking about stuff like that. We'll try this for a second, and we'll just keep it as is. But to call this function, it's actually very straightforward. You would just do script lab, And then you would say exploring custom functions or the name of your module, and then get address. And then we would just close it off, just like that. But of course, when I was writing this, I'm now thinking, I'm like, oh, I wonder if we could change it a little bit. Let me explore something really quickly. Come on. Okay. Where is it? Something I'm thinking of is we have a range object, which is great. I love range objects. I want to see something. Address local. Cell properties fill. I wonder. Font. Let's try something really quick. What would that look like? Font name? Font name? I think that would be font name. I don't know. We'll see in a second. I don't know if it's going to work, but font name. Font name. No. I want font name. Let's try it out. I don't know if it's going to work, but we'll see. Oh, come on. It's because my internet's slow. I pay all this money for good internet, and this is what I get. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I guess not. Well, I don't know. I'm kind of curious about this one because I feel like there's something. It's almost like, what is it? There might be something where you could actually get a, like additional properties to it. I mean, maybe you could do, but see, I don't feel like that would work. Cell count. Well, well, there we go. What did I do? Well, it returned something. I don't know what it returned, but it returned something. What did I specify? Font? Interesting. So I wonder if I don't put that, like if I just put name, would that technically do anything? We'll see. Oh yeah, see, it doesn't like that one, but we're getting closer. I'll keep looking at that one. I don't want to keep the video lagging on just so I can experiment. I'm sure some people find that exciting. Some people probably go like, just stop. Okay, so now we're going to talk about array formulas, right? So array formulas, if you don't remember, come in 3 flavors: spill down, spill right, spill rectangle. For this one, you can actually be very specific about what type of information you're sending back. So you can actually say, hey, it's an array of strings, right? And so here, what I'm saying is it's going to return basically an array. It's a 2-dimensional array. So basically, it's one with potentially a row, and then in each row, well, in this like big row or this big array, it's individual columns, right? So if we think about this like as a matrix, this is column 1, column 2, column 3. So, row 1, row 2, and row 3. So it's basically spilling down. And so it's an array of arrays. And that's really about it. I mean, it's honestly not that bad. Usually with these ones, like it's pretty straightforward. And, you can see here, I just want to specify again that, I'm telling ScriptLab what is being returned and stuff like that, just to kind of make my life easier. And then there's also a new little thing where they'll give you this feature where it kind of highlights it blue. So that's actually kind of neat. But you notice here where if you try to delete that array formula, it's actually gonna give you errors now. So you actually have to go back to the main formula where you delete it. So then that's pretty straightforward for the most part. But if you've used array formulas, but if you haven't, then sometimes you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? So what we'll do is we'll do equals script lab. And then if we go down to spill down, I don't have to specify any arguments because it's already just, spilling it down, but we can see it's now spilled down just like we wanted it. Okay, so that's spilling down. Let's talk about spilling right. It's identical. Literally, the only thing that changes is how you're returning your information. So if you look, this one is arrays that are delimited by commas. This one's just an array inside of an array. So in the other one, there were multiple ones. Here, it's just a single array. Again, if I try to delete it, it's going to flip out and say like, oh my God, what are you doing? And then if I do script lab and then I do spill right, with this one, it's first, second, and third. So it's still working exactly kind of like we expected. So that's spill right. And then again, from a coding perspective, nothing has really changed. Then we get to spill rectangle, right? So this is one where we're returning multiple rows and columns. So from a visualization standpoint, you have this outer array. Inside that outer array, you have individual arrays that will span multiple values, right? So it's like a list within a list if you came from Python, like some of us did. And so in this case, it's a list within a list, and then that each list can have multiple elements to it. So this is row 1, row 2, row 3, column 1, column 1, column 1, column 2, column 2, column 2, column 3, column 3, column 3. And then also notice here I do have numbers, but again, I'm still specifying that it's a string just to keep things standard. Again, if I try to delete anything, it will give me a nice little error like it should. But now if I do script lab and I do spill rectangle, bam, we now have all these wonderful cell values. I really like this one. I personally love array formulas. They're a little bit messy sometimes depending on the complexity, but I think they're awesome. Ooh, now we get to the fun part, kind of. So now we're going to talk about asynchronous functions. So what does an asynchronous function look like, and what are some examples that are relatively simple to comprehend for the most part? Well, in this case, I have a function over here. Well, I had a function over there. Do I not have it anymore? Oh, no. Yeah, it's there. Okay. I didn't put it in there for some reason, but that's okay. So with volatile functions, I'm sorry, not volatile functions. With asynchronous functions, they're changing, right? So they're constantly changing, and the idea behind them is it doesn't necessarily have to kind of do anything in some type of a synchronous order. So one thing doesn't have to happen for it to necessarily happen. The idea of why this is asynchronous is that it's kind of calling a function from a different function. So this is kind of the neat thing behind it, is it, even though our main function is here, it's calling this other function over here, which is basically returning this date, and it's basically it's setting the time. So it's just returning the time, but it's calling this other function, and it sends it back to us and things along that nature. So the idea behind this asynchronous is it doesn't necessarily have to happen one right after the other. They can kind of be spun off right together. And then this is something too where it can kind of do its own thing, and other things can be happening on the side while that thing finishes. And because of that, it's kind of this like neat feature where I don't have to wait for the output to happen before I can move on to the next step. I can kind of just have it start and then have some other stuff spin off at the same time. And then kind of the end result kind of all comes back together. So the way this function is it has two components. So this is going to display the current time in seconds. It takes an argument, which is this streaming invocation. So we can actually make streaming functions with the Excel JavaScript API. We will talk about that later. That's kind of a more advanced topic, and I need some more time to digest that one a little bit more. But really, all it's doing is our function is called clock. And with it, it basically sets an interval. So we have a timer, which is set interval. And then what it's going to do is it's going to get the current time, and then it's going to set the result of that time. So it's going to say, okay, and it's going to, I think, times it by 1,000, if I remember correctly. And then on cancel basically means it's going to clear the interval. So basically, it's just going to clear it out and it's going to stop it. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that this is simply a function up here. So this is get current time. So this is using another function that we've defined up here. So the idea is, again, with asynchronous functions, this one can kind of run on its own. It doesn't have to wait for other stuff to happen. It's just kind of doing its own little thing on its own little planet, and other stuff can happen behind the scenes with it. You just got to be a little bit careful because sometimes with the asynchronous ones, they're going to be changing. But ideally is the asynchronous ones will only change on a certain frequency. So what this would look like is we can see here that I have my time. I have my clock function. So let's see what it looks like. So we'll say script lab, and then we'll do clock. And then you can see that what is happening is it's basically streaming the time, which I think is neat. I think this is a really neat function. It really kind of opens up the door to what we can do. I thought that was kind of interesting. To be honest, I've never tried putting it as like a number, for example. And I don't think it will, actually, because if you think about it, I think that when we technically call this one, where we're saying set result, I think what's happening is, well, I mean, it's returning a string. So I guess in a sense, like we're not technically getting a number back. So because we're getting a string back, we can't technically format it as a number because it doesn't technically, I would say, exist. Like, for example, if I try to change this to like a different date time, I don't think it would actually work because from Excel's perspective, it's not a number. It's actually like a string. So this technically right now is a string. And then of course, we can see that sometimes when you change it, it then changes. See, and that's kind of interesting too, is here, for example, if I make this text, does that impact the formula, right? Does that actually like do something where it's going to like say, hey, if I make this like a text, for example. Oh, no, and then maybe it was just that one little lag for a second. But it's basically like it's streaming this time to you, and it's that time is just simply a string. That's all. So these are kind of neat. I'm really kind of excited to do more with this. But these would basically be how we would incorporate streaming functionality. Hint, hint, TD API maybe? I don't know, maybe. I mean, look here, for example. We're already doing a web request. I wonder. A man can dream. Okay. So what is the idea? Okay. So here's the other thing about the streaming ones. It's running in the background. You can see it's running in the background. So just be weary of that a little bit. They will sometimes run, and if you're not careful, it will not be pretty. So we're now going to take this idea of asynchronous functions, and we're basically going to apply it to a web request. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically get some information from my GitHub, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a request to the GitHub API using my username, and we're going to also provide the repo name. So I have a couple repos right now that are public. One is Sigma Coding YouTube, one is Interactive Broker Python API, and then one is TD Ameritrade. So I pulled this like a week ago, so we'll be kind of curious to see how much it's changed. But from a function perspective, what does that look like? Well, we're still going to name everything the same. So we still got our description, we still got our custom function flag, and we still have our parameters. In this case, we're just saying that they're both strings. And then one's username and one's repo name. And they're going to be used in our web request. And then it's ultimately going to return a number, right? So the idea is that's going to return a number to us. And with that number, we can, do X, Y, Z with it, right? So very important to keep in mind, you want to make sure you're specifying the right return type, because if you don't, obviously that can create an issue, right? Yes. So we're going to create an async function. So with this one, it will basically kind of do its own little thing on the side. And then what we're going to do is we're going to define our URL. So our URL is going to be the githubapi.com/repos. And then it's going to be the username and then the repo name. We're going to fetch that URL and we're going to store it in a variable called response. If that response returns a status code of OK, then return, if it does not equal OK, then return an error and basically say like, hey, something went wrong. Otherwise, take our response, parse the JSON string, and then get the watcher count. So this is basically saying how many people are watching this particular API, right? Or this particular library. So that's basically all it's doing. And then we have our little catch error. So if an error does happen, we can catch it as necessary. And then again, from here, you can kind of see that it's nothing too fancy. Nothing too fancy. Okay, so let's take a look. M6 and M5. 214, we went up. Wonderful. We didn't go up. Most people don't know it's there. We went up. We went up 7. That's not bad. That's not bad for a week, especially on GitHub. And then you can also, if you want, add these because they're numbers, right? That's at least the general idea behind it. Okay. Let's talk about the last one. This is just a little fun one that I thought was interesting. You can find it on on the examples, but they actually have a stock, like get a stock price, right? And so they use the IEX trading API. It's really cool. And honestly, I want to do a series on that soon because I think there's just a treasure trove of data there. If you're willing to pay for it, at least. Well, you can get some of it for free, but other ones you can't. But this one's kind of neat, right? So this is the idea that you can get a stock price. And so you can use script lab and then it's get stock price. And you can kind of tell it's pretty much the same structure. I'm just getting the price this time. And then from here, it does exactly that. I thought this was neat. Obviously, I want to do something with this, something similar to maybe like TD Ameritrade. Yeah, I think it'd be neat. I think there's a lot of opportunity. And so this is honestly one of those things too, where it's like, I know people really like VBA and I know they really don't want to leave it, but it's so nice we can finally do something like this. It's so nice that we can do something like this. We didn't have that capability for a long time, or if you wanted to do it, it was just a pain. You know, it wasn't necessarily super easy to do. The idea that we can now do web requests pretty easily is, I think, really advantageous. And I think it kind of really opens up Excel on a whole new level, because all of a sudden there's APIs out there that you can easily integrate into Excel, where beforehand, if you wanted to, good luck. But with that pretty much does everything. I think, like I said, the only thing I would say maybe you want to do is just get a little bit familiar with it. You know, usually they're right here and you can kind of see what's kind of going on with the asynchronous, with the dynamic arrays and stuff like that. I think this is the volatile function. I think there's some here too. So one is like they'll talk about web requests to external sources. a streaming function. So these are kind of interesting too, because like I said, the streaming functions can be pretty cool once you kind of start doing stuff with them. But yeah, there's a lot here. I definitely encourage you to read it if you get a chance, just because I think there's a lot of advantageous stuff that is going on. So if you get a chance, read it. And then obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Hopefully I can kind of answer them for you. And then hopefully, you can start getting used to using these functions. There's a lot to them. The only other thing I think is some people kind of have asked, like, oh, can you use like the worksheet functions? You cannot use them in custom functions, unfortunately. So that is a limitation right now. You cannot use worksheet functions in custom functions yet. So I don't know what the timeline is for adding that, if they're even going to add them. Me personally, I can kind of see why you wouldn't want to incorporate it in there, but I can also see why you might want to incorporate it in there. So I guess we'll just kind of have to wait and see and see what happens. So yeah, other than that, we will see you in the next video.